in the 1970s, during restoration work at a mosque in the city of Sana'a in Yemen, so the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, a massive amount of ancient Quran manuscripts were discovered. It was actually a false ceiling, and these leaves, mostly parchment, but some paper, were kind of falling down from the ceiling once the lower ceiling was broken open. And among all of the manuscripts that were found there was one manuscript, almost complete, of the Quran, which was the first manuscript we found which actually does differ from the standard manuscript of Uthman, or attributed to Uthman. The thing is about this lower text of this Yemen Quran ancient manuscript is that it actually does not match the reports attributed to any single companion of Muhammad. Wait a second, maybe this destabilizes the whole story. Maybe we've just found an early version of the Quran, which is more primitive than the standard version of the Quran. And therefore, we should start rethinking what verses or what wording is the authoritative Quran that should be used today, at least in an academic context.
Well, Gabriel, it's so good to be back with you. It's been a while since you've been on the channel, but today we are talking about the formation of the Quran. So tell me, to start things off, what is the sort of standard Islamic narrative on how the Quran was formed? Yeah,
thanks, Cameron. Really happy to be chatting with you again on a really big question, how the Quran was composed. The simple form of the traditional narrative around that is more or less in three stages. So one is kind of like the heavenly stage. The Quran is an eternal book sent down with the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. And then the second stage is over the next 22, 23 years. So between AD 610 and AD 632, Muhammad proclaims different elements or passages of the Quran as they're communicated to him by the angel Gabriel. So he proclaims it out loud in Arabic. People memorize them and things. But then stage 3 is accomplished only by his successors. So after his death in AD 632, there's a project usually affiliated with the third sort of successor. His name is Uthman, somewhere around the year AD 650. Who gathers up, different fellows who had memorized the Quran, companions of Muhammad, and some materials where bits of the Quran had been written down, and establishes the authoritative text. And a lot of people say, and online you often find, that's it, kind of end of story, that all three stages were perfectly sort of carried out, so that the text that Muslims have today, or anyone who reads an Arabic Quran, is an earthly replica, letter for letter, of the heavenly Quran that's, outside of time and space, pre-eternal with God.
So tell me about what are some alternative hypotheses that have been proposed by scholars to the formation of the Quran based on, critical historical scholarship?
Yeah, great. So, the first kind of stage of Western non-Muslim scholars analyzing this kind of traditional story more or less would say, okay, we may not buy into stage 1. That is, we may not believe that God sent down the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, or at least as, serious academics, we're not even going to consider that kind of miraculous, supernatural scenario. And so, Western scholars would generally say stage 1 is even out of consideration. But stage 2, what Muhammad said. In stage 3, the project of the caliph to put everything together into the Quran as we now know it, those are basically reliable. So that is, now God is no longer the author of the Quran, but Muhammad is. Muhammad sort of takes God's place. So earlier Western scholars, when they speak about the Quran and, for example, note a verse here or there, they'll say, well, Muhammad says this. And Muslims often will say, well, this is not right. This is objectionable. This doesn't reflect our belief. Islam is not Mohammedanism. Muhammad is not the author of the Quran. God is the author of the Quran. But nevertheless, Western scholars, would kind of run with this idea. More or less, as Muslims tell the story, it's right as long as you exchange Muhammad for God. So the Quran, as we have it, is basically a verbatim transcript. I mean, an interesting element here, of course, is that Muhammad spoke in Arabic and the Quran is preserved in Arabic. So this is obviously different from the situation, for example, of the Gospels, where Jesus spoke principally in Aramaic, but the Gospels are preserved in Greek. So even at that stage with the Gospels, the most fundamentalist Christian would say, yes, this is a Greek version of an originally Aramaic saying. And then Muslims might counter and they would say, well, even your academic scholars say this is basically Muhammad's word. Muhammad spoke in Arabic. So they kind of concede that we have Muhammad's very words here in the Quran. I mean, I don't want to go on forever, Cameron. So I just kind of note that the early stage of scholarship was not very ambitious or revisionary, more or less followed this story. And then, in more recent decades, things get more interesting.
Tell me more about stage 3. How was the Quran sort of formulated or compiled together under these different caliphs? And would you call it like a church structure? Sort of comparing that back to Christianity, how would you look at these two? Because in Christianity, the canonical process was, there was a lot of church councils that spoke on this, and it took a little while to get formalized. What was the timeline comparatively to the formation of the Quran, that stage 3?
Right. Yeah, excellent question. So, most folks would say, let's not use words like church here because ultimately it'll be simplistic because the whole kind of religious architecture of Islam is different. That's true. I would concede that point. But in fact, you do have a sort of centralized power, which is both political and religious, which is more or less the office of the caliphate. So caliph, caliph is a term, the English version of an Arabic term, which was used as the title of the political, but in some elements also the religious successor of Muhammad. So, famously, the first 4 are called the rightly guided caliphs. That's a translation of an Arabic phrase. And really, the first 3, according to the traditional account, they all have a part to play in stage 3, in the way that stage 3 is told. So the standard story is that in the period of the first caliph, whose name was Abu Bakr, and he reigns from AD 632 to AD 634, there was a series of battles known as the Wars of Apostasy. And in those battles against maybe apostates, that is, folks who had left Islam, and Abu Bakr was bringing them back into the fold through these military campaigns, a number of men who had memorized the Quran were killed. Specifically, one battle, the Battle of Yamama, there was a number of these Muslims who had memorized the Quran who were killed. And so there was a lot of pressure put on the first caliph, Abu Bakr. Folks were telling him, listen, we have to get this down in a written text so that the word of God is preserved. And Abu Bakr resisted. He said, well, I can't do what Muhammad didn't do. Muhammad was a messenger of God, and he chose not to write the Quran. So we follow his precedent or example. How could I then write down the Quran? But they eventually convinced him, it's too important. We cannot lose the word of God. And so what he did is, according to the story, he wrote down the Quran in loose leaves of parchment. Arabic would be called suhuf. And he just kind of kept them aside. He didn't distribute them. He kept them aside sort of as a backup, for contingency in which it was needed to make reference to the written Quran. When he dies, these sheets pass on to his successor, the second caliph, whose name was Omar. And Omar had a daughter known as Hafsa, who was also the wife and now widow of the Prophet. So when Omar died, the sheets passed on to Hafsa. This is kind of a nice story because it joins the first and the third caliph, because the story is that around the year AD 650, when the third caliph is leading, the military campaigns of the early Islamic community, the Islamic conquest, there's a new crisis. Now it's not men who had memorized the Quran who are being killed in battle, but instead conflict between Muslim soldiers on the frontier. Sometimes it said it was up in Armenia or what is now Azerbaijan. And so one general in particular, his name is Hudayfa, he rushes back to Medina, speaks to the Caliph Uthman. He's like, listen, we really need to not only establish one codex of the Quran, but distribute it so that there's no more conflict about how to recite the Quran, lest there be division among the Muslims as there is a division among Jews and Christians over their book. So Uthman forms a committee. I mean, I don't want to go on and on camera, but Uthman forms a committee.
Please feel free. This is all fascinating.
He gathers the sheets that were with his daughter, Hafsa, that originally had been written down under the orders of Abu Bakr. There's a fellow from Medina. His name is Zayd ibn Thabit, who's sort of the head of a committee. They consult various folks over how, the Prophet himself recited the Quran. And eventually they establish one sort of official manuscript. We don't
How did they do this?
I'm sorry?
How did they do this?
So,
how did they establish one?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is there are many narrations. So I'm kind of condensing them. I'm doing a kind of diatessaron, like a harmony.
Okay.
Oversimplifying maybe. So there are different narrations which speak of different sort of modalities in which Uthman conducted this business. Zayd ibn Thabit, this scribe who was Medinan, and all of the Meccan men who were with him and were known for memorizing the Quran, they almost always show up in the narrations. Everyone records or recites what they remember the Prophet saying, but then you're able actually to consult the sheets of Hafsa that had been written down under Abu Bakr. And then some narrations say, and there were other things written down as well on, for example, the bark of palm trees or the shoulder blades of camels or parchments. And so through these various consultations, Uthman ultimately establishes the one authoritative codex. And, today people will speak about the Uthmanic codex. It takes some unpacking to clarify what that means in 2025, for example.
Okay, so under Uthman, I've heard the story as well that he burned the alternative copies. Is that historically reliable information?
So that narration is sort of an organic part of all of these stories. So it's as reliable as any of the other elements. I mean, it's ubiquitous. It's all over the place in the early sources. Now, the premise of that detail of the story is that Uthman was not the first one actually to bring all of the elements of the Quran together and to bind them into one book or codex. In fact, in an unofficial way, other companions of Muhammad had done that on their own. So these narrations, they don't really explain all the motives, but folks usually assume that someone like Ibn Mas'ud, who has the most famous personal codex, or Ubay, his name comes up a lot, maybe Ali, who will become the fourth caliph and is beloved especially by the Shia. Most people assume that these folks, they just love the Quran so much that it was kind of an expression of their veneration of the Quran to create personal copies. But according to the story, once the official codex is established by Uthman, now these personal copies are a problem. I mean, remember, Cameron, the whole idea of establishing a sort of caliphal official version of the Quran was to do away with potential division or conflict between folks who, I mean, the story is Syrian and Iraqi soldiers were reciting the Quran in different ways. So Uthman is going to address this division and conflict by having just one version, you know. So like, I don't know, if the King James version were all that was ever around of the Bible in English, then no one would be fighting about the translation of this or that Hebrew or Greek word. It's kind of the mentality, right? That's the idea of the story, at least. Now these variant manuscripts, these personal codices or copies of the Quran, they're suddenly a problem. So there are different narrations that, you know, Uthman recognized this. They had to be eliminated. He put out an order that everyone had to give these over. Ibn Mas'ud resisted. There are various narrations that in his mosque in Iraq, he fought the soldiers of the caliph who had come to take his copy. You know, there are even statements of Ibn Mas'ud, you know, kind of flexing about how much of the Quran he had already memorized when Uthman was but a boy. And so the story goes that ultimately they were all destroyed, and you know, basically harmony was established through Uthman's version.
So just to ask a clarifying question, were there different versions of the Quran being recited and transmitted? Is that why they burned the other copies? So otherwise, I can't really make sense of
why would you
directive.
do it? Yes, because of, according to logic of these narrations, because of variance. Yes. Okay. This can get complicated really quickly. So just kind of like the simple version of the question of variance. There are two sorts of variance to the Quran that academics speak about. So we're speaking about sort of the primordial variants of the Quran,
right,
which reflect these personal copies of the Quran that certain companions of Muhammad had written down on their own accord. These variants can be significant. So, for example, they involve chapters of the Quran that are not in Uthman's version. And there are reports that they also did not include chapters of the Quran, famously the last two chapters, 113 and 114, that did make their way into Uthman's version. So, these are very significant. It's very important to add, however, that our knowledge of these personal copies of the Quran, if they ever existed, comes only through later Islamic narrations. So, you know, someone has a story, in Arabic you've got a khabar, a narration. Maybe it first appears in like the 10th century, and this Muslim scholar would say, oh yeah, I don't know if this is a nice example, but in Quran 11, there's a story that when the three men, in the Quran they're called messengers, visited Abraham, there's a story there's a verse in the Quran today which says that Abraham's wife, who we know is Sarah, that she was standing, qa'imatun. And then in some of the commentaries, you'll read a little note which will say, oh, in Ibn Mas'ud's, I might be getting the names here wrong for this specific variant, in Ibn Mas'ud's Quran, there was a couple of words added which indicated that Abraham was sitting. If you go to Quran 11 today, you won't find that sentence, that Abraham was sitting. That's only in a report about what hypothetically would have existed in one of these personal copies of the Quran. So these companion variants are significant. Additional words, additional verses, sometimes additional chapters of the Quran.
Okay. Now, comparing this to the Bible, was there ever a process of this sort of unification of the Christian canon, where we were ruling out, or if there were these variants or variations, and we would systematically remove them from existence?
There is no critical edition of the Quran today based on manuscript evidence. So, for example, you know, I don't know if this is interesting. I think it's kind of addressing a different element of your question. But for example, you know, if you look at a Greek New Testament today, I know famously the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, or the same for the Hebrew Old Testament. You'll find, at the bottom of each page, data on all of the manuscripts, which will tell you, oh, it has this word instead of that word, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have anything like that anywhere in the world today. So there was never a process by which all of the reports of the companion, the personal copies of the Quran, were brought together, and then folks compared what is in the official Ottoman Quran with those reports to see which one is more authentic. I think a New Testament scholar would use the word primitive. But instead, the tradition accepted. Again, I'm kind of running, Cameron, with the idea that the stories about Uthman are authentic and probably should not be taken for granted. But let's just run with that idea a bit more. So the tradition basically accepted that Uthman did his job perfectly. So all three stages, if we go back to this kind of system of thinking through the composition of the Quran, sending down of the Quran, the proclamation of the Quran, and the collection of the Quran, all three stages were perfect, not a single error in them. And so the Islamic tradition really overwhelmingly said, there's no point in looking at these companion codices or these other personal copies of the Quran because Uthman did it right. Now, Cameron, there are two added bits of information that are really, really critical to kind of tell the story, even in a basic way. One is that in the 1970s, during restoration work at a mosque in the city of Sana'a in Yemen, so the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, a massive amount of ancient Quran manuscripts were discovered. It was actually a false ceiling, and these leaves, mostly parchment, but some paper, I think, were kind of falling down from the ceiling once the lower ceiling was broken open. And among all of the manuscripts that were found there was one manuscript, almost complete, of the Quran, which was the first manuscript we found which actually does differ from the standard manuscript of Uthman or attributed to Uthman. So that's really interesting. And
we just discovered this fairly recently in the 70s.
Exactly. And the most well-known study about this manuscript basically aligns this manuscript within the story of Uthman, Omar, and Abu Bakr, and says more or less that, well, this is one of those personal copies of the Quran that was, supposed to be destroyed, and Uthman's sort of purge of variant versions. And now we have the first kind of companion codex of the Quran, actually manuscript evidence. Now, in fact,
what date? Do you mind if I jump in here? What date does it date back to? How have scholars dated that?
It does not have a date itself. Some manuscripts the scribe will indicate the date, and so we can only go with the carbon dating. There's some contention about this, but the carbon dating is as early as any other manuscript. So it's part of a class of manuscripts that through you can do carbon dating because they're parchment. So it's organic, it's from an animal skin. So it's organic material. And it probably is about the time of Uthman or even earlier. It's a contentious topic though, the dating bit.
Sure. So throw out a number for people that haven't been following with the
Oh,
different
sorry.
chaos.
I should add that right away. Yeah. So Muhammad died 632. Uthman, he reigns between 644 and 656. Just for simplicity's sake, people like to put the collection of the Quran right in the middle of his reign. So 650. So
interesting. So
18 years
even
more or less after Muhammad.
So even incorporating this into the sort of standard narrative, these guys that put these different parchments on the top of this mosque were sort of acting against the orders of Uthman?
Yes, possibly. So I was going to say yes and no, but maybe it's better just to say possibly. Now, this manuscript is actually what's known as a palimpsest, which means that there's a lower text. There's a lower layer of writing which was erased, which was done with parchment just by scraping. They didn't have like the back of pencils.
Oh, wow. So we've preserved both of those.
Right. And so it was the lower text was erased by scraping, and then a new text, in this case, also Quran, the standard version of the Quran, was written on top of it. But through, different technological ways of infrared technology, basically, we are now able to recover the lower text, because through scraping, you can't erase it all. You can't get rid of all of the ink that was used. So, again, if you want to place it in the Uthman story, you could say, it really was destroyed. It was scraped away. So people did listen to Uthman. Now, the thing is about this lower text of this Yemen Quran, ancient manuscript, is that it actually does not match the reports attributed to any single companion of Muhammad. So it doesn't match. I've mentioned some of these names. Ibn Mas'ud. It doesn't match the reports about the version of Ubay. It doesn't match the version attributed to Ali. It matches some of them in some places, others in other places, and other places doesn't match any report that we have. So,
explain that really quick for me. What does that mean? They're not matching these other reports.
Right,
what reports are you talking about?
So until the 1970s, all we had was the Arabic text of the Quran that is basically read everywhere. Oh, sorry, I've got it upside down there. The Arabic text of the Quran that's basically read everywhere. So, here are the Arabic words inside. And that's all we had. Plus, Arabic books, which I'm looking for a nice Arabic book. That would look somewhat like this, bigger books. Arabic books, which would have reports that, we don't have it today, but Ibn Mas'ud's personal copy of the Quran had these 500 differences. I'm just making up a number now. 500 differences with the Quran that folks read today. And this other guy, Ubay, had this list of differences. So when people found this manuscript in Yemen, Cameron, they were really excited. And one of the first things, once they, did the infrared and recovered the lower text, one of the first things they did was to compare it to the reports in these books. This is actually some totally different book, but just to give an example, visual aid. One of the first things they did was to compare these lists to the reports in the books. Let me go back. One of the first things they did was to compare them new manuscript evidence with the lists in these sorts of books to see actually, did we find Ibn Mas'ud's Quran, personal copy of the Quran? Did we find Ubay's personal copy of the Quran? Whose personal copy was this? Because we know from the reports there were personal copies. And what they found was it doesn't match any of them. So there's basically two conclusions you could draw from this. One is, it's just someone else. And the most famous study, in an academic journal of this manuscript, that was, his name is Behnam Sadiki. That was his argument. Yeah, okay, it's not Ibn Mas'ud, it's not Ubay, but probably some other companion also did something similar, and we found his personal copy of the Quran. And anyway, it doesn't matter because, he doesn't say it this crassly. He's, careful scholar. But, most folks would say it doesn't matter because Uthman's version was a right version. But the other conclusion you could draw is, wait a second, maybe this destabilizes the whole story. Maybe we've just found an early version of the Quran, which is more primitive than the standard version of the Quran. And therefore, we should start rethinking what verses or what wording is the authoritative Quran that should be used today, at least in an academic context.
Yes, that was a very good clarification. In an academic context, the earlier the writing is, the more historically, what's the best way to put this? I'm not as eloquent as you.
Yeah, authentic.
Yeah, the more authentic
that's the
it would be.
standard idea. Now, people might say, but here's this or that case. So there's some exceptions, but that is absolutely the standard idea.
Okay. Wow, that blew my mind. I had no idea about this new find in the 1970s. I've read a couple of your books, but that one didn't come up yet. And maybe it was just because I was It's been a while since I've read your material.
I'm not the best expert on these questions. Shadi Hekmat Nasser is a great scholar who works on the transmission of the Quran. It's extremely contentious. I mean, it's one of those fields in Quranic studies. So Quranic studies generally is contentious, but it's one of those subfields, where people are really out for blood. And there's been some very unpleasant back and forth between different scholars. The first scholar to really work extensively on that manuscript was a German named Gerd Puin. And then other scholars have worked since then. Now, if it's okay, Cameron, I just want to add the other important note to get to, the basic story about Quran variants down. So I've been speaking to this point basically only about what people call the codex variants. So the idea that there were companions who had their own personal copy of the Quran, there you have very significant variants to the standard text of the Quran. I've mentioned added chapter missing, verses different, like the thing about Abraham sitting down, that sort of thing. Now, there is a whole nother body of literature about variants, which is now what we call is canonical. So these are variants that, for the most part, Islamic tradition would say are basically legit, because the standard text associated with Uthman is written in a simplified script. Basically, like in English, people used to use something, I think, before computers were widely available, called shorthand. I think my mother was able to write in shorthand. So basically, it's a kind of shorthand. People like to call it a skeletal consonantal script. So it's like a skeleton of a script, doesn't have flesh on it, that kind of thing. What this means is it allows for ambiguity and different possibilities of reading the same marking. And this necessarily generated difference in the Islamic community. Folks started reading the same word. For example, there's a word in the first chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha, which Muslims, often use in their prayers, which is, often read as Malik. But that same word in the skeletal script can be read Malik. Here, the difference in meaning is pretty small. Malik means someone who possesses something, and Malik means a king. And both are legit ways of reading Uthman's text. Now, there's some of the Arabic books behind me are just lists and lists of canonical or official accepted variants to the standard text of Uthman. And this story gets complicated, but just to fast forward to the end, people tend not to know that this is part of Islamic tradition, because in 1924 in Cairo, one standard Arabic version of the text, not written in the simplified script, but written in what's called the complete script, scriptio plena, was established, and that spread throughout the world. And almost everyone uses this Cairo edition of the Quran now. But among other things, the presence of all of these canonical variants means that the story, if you remember way back, the story about the soldiers fighting about the pronunciation of the Quran, Syrians and Iraqis, and the general came to Uthman, we got to stop these guys from fighting. The story now seems less convincing, because the sort of script that Uthman wrote down or would have written down would not actually tell you how to pronounce the Quran, because it's just a shorthand. It would not have that function at all. Something doesn't work here. So it's another bit which sort of destabilizes the traditional story about Uthman.
So one question that I had while you were speaking was, what is our earliest manuscript of the Uthmanic text, the sort of simplified version?
The manuscripts, in my personal opinion, are quite early. Now, through the carbon dating, there are different ways to date a text. You can analyze what's called a paleography, so you can look at the nature of the script, or you can do carbon dating. There are other ways too that you can do it that have more to do with like the parchment itself, codicol it. But in terms of the carbon dating, you just get a range of dates. So you might get a range of 30 years or 50 years. But the earliest layer of texts are usually dated between 600 and 650. So very, very early.
Okay. So why wouldn't Muslims use the Uthmanic text as opposed to the one that was found in Cairo?
Yeah, so the short answer is they do. The Ottomanic text, however, is written in the simplified form. So if you look at a manuscript, you'll see the simplified script. So it doesn't actually answer all your questions about how to read this. More work has to be done. Basically, slashes and dots have to be added. And that's what was done in Cairo. It's actually very complicated, and it used to be contentious because there are many options. I mean, for example, Muslims sometimes they'll say there's 7 legitimate ways of doing it, 7 systems, maybe 10. But then even for the 7, there are 2 versions of each of the 7, so actually 14. But more work has to be done with the traditional script of Uthman to get to a written Quran that you can actually read and know how to pronounce. And that's what was done in Cairo.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So back to the Uthman Codex, do we have any variant manuscript evidence of the Uthmanic text? Or so is there like multiple manuscripts that date back to around the same time period with variants in their textual...
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to thinking about the story of Uthman, there are basically 2 ways to sort of learn more. One way is to look at the Islamic literature, books like those ones, and see what they say. There are whole books written on different versions of the Uthmanic script with very minor variations. Or you could say, okay, I'm not going to trust the traditional reports, those books back there at all. I'm just going to go to the manuscript.
Is it because they come too late?
Yeah, because they come too late, basically. So I'm just going to trust what my eyes can actually see in the manuscript evidence. And, there've been terrific scholars like Marijn van Putten, Alba Fadeli, and others who have been, working on the manuscripts. Asma Hilali, many great scholars have been working on this. And then, so when you get to the manuscripts, for me, it's better not to even bring up the name Uthman, because then you're mixing the traditional reports with the manuscripts. So you just speak about, here's what I see in this manuscript that's found today in Paris, this manuscript that's found today in London. And what we actually find is, with some minor variations, when it comes to the skeletal text, that simplified text, the only significant exception to the text type is that famous manuscript found in Yemen in the 1970s. So we do have this remarkable consistency in this skeletal text. Where we don't have consistency is when it comes to how Muslims, as the tradition continued, began to produce manuscripts that had more of the dots and slashes, and they were trying to fill in what's ambiguous and unclear in the basic text. And at this point, to me, it's obvious there was not a standard oral tradition of how to read the text, because the manuscripts are all over the place. You have, thousands of variants of ways of reading that text.
But you call those canonical variations.
Yeah. So there's kind of an asterisk there. I could go on. It would get more complicated. But yes, for the most part, those sorts of variants, there are usually certain rules that they have to be subjected to, are considered canonical or legit by Islamic tradition. In fact, Cameron, it's a really cool thing for a young Muslim student of the Quran to be able to recite even one surah, one chapter, according to all 7 systems. So it's not at all seen like, oh, this is something we have to shove aside. It's going to make us look bad. Generally it's embraced by Muslims.
So Gabriel, what sort of sparked this entire interview was this paper that I read of yours recently, where you talk about the doublets in the Quran. And these doublets are very important because they support, you talk about this theory about there being more than just one canonical text. Can you talk about the finding and the theory that you talk about in this paper?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Cameron. So I wrote a paper called The Quranic Doublets, or the doublets of the Quran. People will find it easy on my academia site. And it began with a really innocent observation that some very famous verses of the Quran are more or less reproduced verbatim in other places inside the Quran. So this is what a doublet is, basically. So it's not a case of a small turn of phrase, what some people call a formula, 2-3 words appears now and then, which you could see, like, people might have a habit of speech. I'm sure I do. And I always say, like, sort of, for example. It's not that kind of, it's not me saying sort of, right? We're speaking about often complete verses. So 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 words, which are repeated almost verbatim. So famously, for example, the Quran is a verse in chapter 2. The Quran is 114 chapters, which speaks about the believers, the Jews, the Christians, and a group called the Sabaeans. And it goes on to say that, they will have their reward. They need not be fearful. They won't be sad. Basically, it says, these groups are all going to heaven. Right now, the theology is not super important. It's just the text. So you have that verse in chapter 2, and then you look at chapter 5, and with very small variations, you have the same verse. A verse in the Quran in chapter 4, which declares that there's one sin that God will not forgive, which is associating something that is not God with God. That verse, which says a little bit more, it basically says God has the power to forgive anyone he wants, except for this. That verse is repeated basically verbatim inside the same chapter 4. So I began to notice these, just kind of write them down now and then. And then I got to 29, I think it's 29, something like that, of these doublets. Things I had never noticed because, I began to do computer searches and things like that. And this was pretty cool. Almost no one had spoken about doublets in the Quran. People do note in their commentaries here and there, like, oh, see also this verse. So I'm not the first one to recognize that you have these parallel verses, but no one had sort of spoken about doublets or duality as a major feature of the Quranic text. And in fact, I've got 20 something there in the article, but if you're a little more chill with your criteria for identifying a doublet, which in fact folks are in New Testament scholarship, if you tolerate, more variations with a word there or a grammatical tense, something with a morphology, you can get to hundreds of these doublets in the Quran pretty quickly. I wrote this article and, I'm very confident about the first point, which is that these sorts of doublets reflect a process of editing or redaction. If you look at parallel texts that have these kinds of lengthy, almost verbatim doublets, they are not produced from someone saying the same thing, more or less, in year 1, and then again in year 4, or in spring, and that same year in winter, or whatever. So these do not reflect oral variations. They reflect written variations, very often because there was some sort of primitive declaration which was transmitted in different communities, and then 2 versions of it were brought together. That's one way you can get a doublet. They were brought together in the process of redaction, and for whatever reason, people do have arguments about this, they were both kept. Maybe because they had already each, within perhaps the block of text in which they were embedded, had a sort of quasi-canonical status already. So I think that's something. I was pretty happy with that. So the first point, and I think the point that I feel more comfortable asserting and defending, is the doublets as a sign of a written process, not of transmission of an existing text, but a written process of composition or redaction, editing of the Quran. Then there's another point which we could speak about separately, which, I kind of presented as a hypothesis. I'm still sort of unsure how much I'm willing to fight about it, which has to do with the distribution of the doublets.
The distribution referring to the Meccan and the Medinan.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. So overwhelmingly, doublets tend to be either Meccan or Medina. I'll just explain what that means a little bit. So the traditional idea is that Muhammad was in his native city of Mecca for the first part of his career as a prophet, so from AD 610 to AD 622. And then he had his famous migration or hijrah to a city to the north, which eventually got the name Medina. And he was there from 622 to 632. And the standard idea is that everything was different in Medina, like things changed dramatically. And so one can look at a certain passage in the Quran, or at least a certain chapter, and by certain features, some of which are textual, some of which have to do with content, you can identify that chapter as Meccan or Medinan, basically early 610 to 622 or late 622 to 632. Now, it does so happen that there is a preponderance of doublets that are either Meccan or Medinan, in very few, at least according to the criteria I use to establish a doublet, that are Meccan Medinan, that cross over. So it's something like 85% are within one of the two sort of traditional units of the Quran, and which could suggest that, in fact, because doublets reflect a process of writing and redaction, they're produced during the production of a final text, that the doublets are within the Meccan text or within the Medinan text. This trend could suggest that there was a text produced, which was basically a Meccan text, and another text that was produced, which was a Medinan text, and then eventually they were integrated into the Quran as we know it.
And this runs contrary to the sort of standard Islamic narrative, right? That Muhammad didn't even have a written collection.
Yes,
in his
absolutely. It runs not only contrary to that point, but also to the story we sort of told before of the work of the first caliphs to bring the text together, because their work was confined basically to rearranging pieces and doing a triage between inauthentic things and authentic things. At no point did they creatively reshape the text or look at two different already canonical texts and bring them together and think about how they could be integrated. So yeah, it's dramatically different. I mean, just to say, Cameron, maybe this is for another episode. The way I think, I'm now showing all my cards. The way I think about the composition of the text is that the first step is to completely bracket the stories about Abu Bakr and Uthman and Ali, etc. Just bracket those entirely and begin by analyzing the features of the text itself. So, I'm ready to say other things as well that will depart from the traditional narrative.
And then you would look at the manuscripts later on, or which one would you look at first? The manuscripts first, or the internal features? Because I mean, I think you'd have to look at the manuscripts first, right? Because those sort of set the earliest dates for the Quran?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So the question that I seek to answer in my own work is not so much whether this or that version of the Quran is more primitive or ancient, but instead, how did more or less the standard text of the Quran, if we just run with, even if we run with the Cairo text, we just use the standard text of the Quran, what, based on the internal features of this text, what can we tell about the process of its composition? So it's, in part because I'm just not a specialist in manuscripts. Others are much better qualified to do that work. But there's an incredible amount that we can tell by a careful, patient reading of the text itself.
I want to give you an analogy. I was thinking really hard about your doublets paper and trying to come up with an analogy for people to really better understand what's going on here. I've got one. It's not perfect, but I want to run it by you and then get your thoughts and whether or not you think it's any good. It may help the audience. We'll see. So imagine that you've got this notebook of stickers from a child. Okay. And half of the notebook is blue, uses blue paper. Half of it uses green paper. Okay, representing the Medinan and the Meccan portions of the Quran. So in the blue part, you've got, various stickers all over the place. And then you've got these stickers that sort of duplicate in those sections. Maybe the kid really liked those types of stickers or whatever. So you've got these duplicates in the blue part, and you've got these duplicates in the green part. And so your hypothesis is that, well, actually, this booklet that we have was originally two separate booklets of just the blue and just the green, and then someone later put them all together. Now, I know that's not like 100% point for point on everything. It's just supposed to give an analogy to help people understand.
Great. And, part of the beauty of analogies is to keep them simple because their instructive or explanatory power, it disappears when you make them too complicated. Then what's the point of analogy? Right. But just complicate things a little bit. The evidence of other textual traditions is that the process of bringing together a text, what we generally call redaction, it is almost never, it can almost never be reduced to simply basically insertions. You just join things together and leave them as they are. The process of redaction, and this isn't even really making a claim about the Quran or the New Testament or anything else. This is kind of it's part of like culture and human psychology. When you bring things together, what we find inevitably is that it's a creative process. So sometimes it involves making two textual units fit more neatly or logically together. Sometimes it involves developing a certain point that the redactor is attached to by changing the wording or adding the wording. So, that's an important part of this scenario that in this larger story of the composition of the Quran, the process of redaction was more than just kind of gluing things together that were originally separate.
Right. It's about editing. And as you say, it was sort of creatively editing what was there. And so, one objection would be, and you already sort of touched on this, but you didn't really expound. So maybe you can just explain a little bit further. Why do the doublets imply that there were redactors and editors sort of duplicating these verses as opposed to Muhammad just wanting to reiterate a point that he made previously?
Great question. So I'm sort of working against one of my good friends and esteemed, much more important professor than me, Fred Donner at the University of Chicago. So he famously said that one way to account for repetition in the Quran is to imagine a politician's stump speech. So imagine, Joe Biden or George W. Bush or whoever, he's on the campaign trail and he's got this kind of set speech, whatever it might be, like, I'm going to reduce regulations or, I'm going to go after the 1% or whatever it might be. And he's got a little story he tells about his childhood. And he gives us basically the same speech. He's got it internalized mentally, whether he's in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or Raleigh-Durham or Sacramento, California. He kind of gives the same speech, but every time he, gets up at the, stands on a chair at the local diner, it just naturally, it's a little bit different. So that's basically, that's how we can account for so you have 7 stories about Adam and the devil. They're a little different. It's because Muhammad, in 614 on a Tuesday morning in Mecca, he stood up and gave it. In 617 on a Saturday afternoon in another corner in Mecca. And then later in Medina, in 623, he gave it a third time, a little difference, like Sacramento and Raleigh-Durham, all that. So that's his sort of model. The problem with the model, and this pains me because I dearly respect and admire Fred Donner, is that we don't find this layer of consistency almost verbatim on lengthy doublets. If you compare other bodies of literature which have this textual feature, once you get this much consistency in textual units that are this long, it's inevitably a sign of written transmission, not oral variation because a performer did it a bit differently spontaneously. When oral performers do that from Raleigh-Durham to Sacramento or Mecca to Medina, their variants are not just one word. Their variants are like incredibly variant. Stephen Shoemaker has shown this. He has a couple great chapters on the question of memory science. Like oral performers, you may think they memorize everything and they're verbatim. They are not. They are absolutely not. So basically, that's it. And what they actually show, though, is probably more the transmission history of an original saying. So imagine there's a primitive saying remembered by the early community. Let's bracket whether Muhammad actually said it or not. Primitive saying, which is transmitted probably in writing and preserved by two groups within the community. And then eventually probably a top-down process takes place through like the administration, the officials, and then these two versions of the same saying are preserved.
Okay, so I understand now. I think maybe for just the first time of why you push back so hard against this is that just oral transmission. If you want to duplicate the same idea, and if you're doing this orally, because that's what that's a sort of standard Islamic narrative, right? That this was just an oral recitation from Muhammad, and so he would have said it differently. Well, maybe here's another objection. What if this is exactly what was given to him from Gabriel, right? And Gabriel duplicated the exact same saying twice, and so he was being very accurate to what he was given.
Yes, I mean I think that's a coherent pushback. So someone could say if you want to subscribe to sort of the angelic dictation of the text in Arabic to Muhammad, then I think that's coherent. There are minor variations, though. I mean, that might be one hiccup for that theory. Sometimes, if the preposition instead of be is li or something, or the word is a little bit, the morphology of one word is changed a little bit. So there are still those minor variations. So then I guess you would have to say, I don't know, Gabriel maybe improved it a little bit by changing this. A Muslim wouldn't want to say that. Just gave him another. So it's a little bit complicated, but I think that's actually more coherent, that more religious theological argument, than someone saying, oh, it's oral performance. Because like the human brain, it just doesn't, if Muhammad is a human, and Muslims, of course, affirm that, the human brain doesn't function that well. I mean, there are great examples of this that Stephen Shoemaker speaks about in cultures that really prize the memory. They say, oh, we're better than the group, in that other city. We memorize everything. And if you don't have a written text to refer to, no one memorizes anything to the point that they can reproduce it verbatim.
How does this impact how we view the Bible? The sayings of Jesus, and how it was sort of orally transmitted at first and then eventually written down. I wonder if this has any implications for
it's a great. I'm tempted to say a couple of things because that question does interest me. It's interesting theologically and historically, also interesting. I mean, the whole game is different, of course, because presumably Jesus spoke principally in Aramaic. Some people say, well, there was some spoken Hebrew still around. More and more scholars, I think, believe that he knew some Greek as well. In any case, he was principally speaking in Aramaic. All of the Gospels, despite people who love the idea that there was an early Aramaic proto-gospel, but all the gospel evidence, all the manuscripts, the early ones are in Greek. So, I mean, it's just completely different. Doesn't make it without problems or issues to be discussed. But, the first evangelists, they knew they were not producing Jesus's verbatim statements. They were giving a Greek version of what he would have said in Aramaic. So it's really different. I mean, it's apples and oranges, or, I don't know, football and baseball. Okay.
One other question. So your hypothesis, or the hypothesis that you're entertaining in this paper, is that is it that there are two pre-Quran canonical texts? There was one canonical text that was sort of traditionally Medinan, and then one that was traditionally Meccan, and these were both canonical texts, or were they just source? Because what I'm thinking of here is that there are obvious overlaps in wording and in the precise sort of, you might even call it doublets or even triplets in the Gospels, right? And typically people will infer, well, there was actually an original source, maybe even Q, something along those lines.
Yeah, this is where we get Q, 100%.
Yeah, and so you're
Yeah.
you're just proposing the same sort of idea, right? That there was an original, but you go further than that, right? You say that they were editing and they were adding things or
No, I don't
creatively.
go further. I don't think. And anyway, the principal contribution of the article is just to give new evidence for the written composition of the Quran. That's the principle. So doublets as a sign of the written composition of the Quran. That already is a sort of revolutionary idea, because the tradition says that the Quran was a simple putting ink to parchment of things that were composed orally, either by Muhammad himself or from a religious perspective, by God outside of time and space. So that's the principal contribution. That is what I am ready to defend. I think I've got compelling evidence for that. The hypothesis in the second part of the article, proposes, based on the distribution of these doublets, the possible idea of two, and I don't even really feel comfortable using the language Meccan and Medinan because that assumes too much about the tradition, but two pre-canonical earlier versions of Muhammad's proclamations, one of which is today represented by surahs that we call Meccan and the other Medinan. But I've had people push back, and I think some of the arguments against me are pretty convincing. So it's not a hill I'm ready to die on.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is very interesting stuff, that this runs counter to the sort of standard Islamic narrative, because the standard Islamic narrative is that this was orally recitated from Muhammad to his companions. Eventually it was written down,
right,
through the caliphs,
right.
Stage 3. And this one is like, well, actually it was written down pretty early. It was written down like really early.
Yeah, or to be even more radical, it's not really that it was written down. It was written down, as you say, Cameron. But from an academic historical point of view, and of course, I respect Muslim religious theological views, but from an academic historical point of view, it might explain more if we think not so much of people trying to remember what Muhammad said and then writing it down to the best of their ability, but rather that the text itself was the beginning of the Quran. So from the beginning, it was composed in a written manner. It would take more to explain that, and maybe another episode, but it actually is a pretty profound difference of how one thinks of the origin of the Quranic text.
So the editors, the redactors, were just creating the Quran. So it doesn't have any sort of tie to Muhammad at all, or do you think that it still does on this hypothesis?
It would still have a tie to Muhammad. I'm going to take a break, get out of performance mode in part because I have to go. So, I think there are interesting things that can be said, I think, in a kind of a sober, prudent manner about that. But it's just going to take too long to explain. It is really interesting, but it's just, there's too much there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel Reynolds. This has been very enlightening and very interesting, and we hope to have you back on the channel sometime soon.